Welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast, proudly presented by Venture Hunting and Outdoors. If you're like us and passionate about hunting, spearfishing, and many other outdoor-related pursuits, with an eagerness to fast-track your learning, then this podcast is perfect for you. G'day legends, and welcome back to another episode of the Twin Elements podcast. Today's episode is going to be a solo podcast where you are listening to Ayden Doumtsis, and rather than the educational, dense, informative podcasts that we've been releasing over the last couple of weeks with a lot of those wild game cooking and processing sort of podcasts, today we're going to be doing a bit of story time where we relive a recent hunt that I embarked on in the Basalt Wall region of North Queensland, Australia, where I embarked on a chital deer hunt, trying to take a mature stag with the bow, or at the worst case, do a bit of scouting, get out in the outdoors and sort of relive some chital deer hunting up at my business, which I call Spotted Safaris. In this episode, we're also going to be touching on a few thoughts regarding wet weather hunting in the tropics and strategies surrounding that, as well as navigating stalks with hundreds of eyes and ears, as we come to expect with chital deer. And we're also going to be touching on some FAQs. So, as you've come to expect, if you want to send in a FAQ, please do so to info@twinelements.com.au with the subject line FAQ, or please Instagram DM us or anywhere on our socials on Ayden Doumtsis Outdoors, James Doumtsis Outdoors, or Twin Elements. And without further ado, we'll get into the podcast. I have personally been using Hoyt bows for over 20 years now, building the most innovative and technological advanced gear. Their carbon bows are the lightest, leanest, and ultra-compact on the market. Quite frankly, I treat mine like hell, throwing it around, banging it on rocks and scrub. Time and time again, it has performed when I've needed it the most. Get serious, get Hoyt. So I guess going into this trip, what I should say is just that I hadn't really had any hunt objectives leading into it. As I said earlier, I own my own business, which is Spotted Safaris, which is a guided chital deer hunting operation based out of North Queensland. I sort of live up in Townsville and then travel out west towards Chital Stag to do these hunts across a couple of different properties. And this was actually my first hunt of the year personally. I have had a number of Spotted Safaris trips fall through just with the sheer amount of flooding and rainfall that's happened in the East Coast and North Queensland sort of area. Obviously being the wet season over the summer months up there, it can be a little bit challenging because we can't always predict the weather. And as a result, unfortunately, a couple of clients pulled the pin on some of those hunts, and then due to another client pulling the pin due to personal reasons and like illnesses in the family and things like that, last minute I was a little bit available to basically go out over a bit of a weekend period, a few days, and hopefully, as I said, do a bit of hunting for myself, but mainly just scout for upcoming clients and sort of get to know a few properties, know what's about, and just get out for an adventure. In terms of Spotted Safaris, if anyone hears this podcast and then is obviously interested in joining me for a hunt up there in North Queensland on the chital deer, please email me at spottedsafaris@hotmail.com. You can always send a message to me via the DMs on social media. We've got Facebook, Instagram, and a YouTube, which is growing and does have some amazing content. I've been hunting this property personally for around 15 years now. Originally setting up the guiding in around 2019, which is when we became a proper business. I'd been guiding mates on that property and friends and family and things like that for a long time before that. But in 2019, things really took off. And ever since, we've really been managing the deer populations with a strict, emphasis on population dynamics as well as trophy and stag potential. So the trophy potential has been getting better and better with, 30-inch deer getting taken every year and increasing in number, but they still are a rarity. And I think just in general that it's a bit of a misnomer in terms of, you hear people talk about 100-point buffalo, 1 metre barra, 30-inch chital deer, 30-inch sambar. And I think people just come to expect that 30-inch chital deer grow on, trees and you can just pluck them off like an apple. Whereas I've hunted chital deer for 15 years now, and every year you see a couple, but I also hunt I'd be in the 1% of hunters that hunt chital deer more than most. So it's one of those things that they're certainly out there. You just have to put in a lot of hard work and effort, and obviously, know the areas and know the deer tendencies and things like that. But that does bring us into this hunt today, because as always, we're striving for those more mature deer. And I guess leading into this scouting trip, I do place a lot of pressure on myself to find quality animals for the clients that I've got coming up. And this hunt was like no other. My main emphasis was on scouting, videoing in particular, getting some quality footage for spotted safaris, and then being able to report back to clients. But as you'll come to hear, when I did encounter a certain chital stag, everything changed. And for myself, my eyes really did light up. And this was a pretty amazing animal that I ended up having a stalk on. So to set the scene, it had been raining, as I said and sort of alluded to earlier, in North Queensland much of the year. This hunt took place in early March. So up until then, there'd been quite a few 100 mils of rain in North Queensland. And as it tends to come in, it doesn't rain for a little while. And then over like a week period, they might get 300 or 400 mils. And then that obviously leads to a lot of runoff, a lot of flooding. Areas in these big basins and catchments basically flood. The Charters Towers region does get a little bit of rain from even further north up towards Tully, which is one of the wettest places on earth. The raining conditions prior to the trip, it had been super wet with a couple of 100 mils. And I was actually flirting with the idea of not going because I didn't want to get stuck there, because I did have an appointment with James basically to get down to hunt the rut in sort of mid to late March. Anyway, I did elect to go out for this chital deer trip, but I knew heading into it that it would be super wet, that the deer basically would be on the higher ground. So out there, the topography is quite flat, as you can imagine, but there are some gullies, big natural lake systems that have, obviously a bit lower elevation where it floods, and then you get all these amazing white poplar gums and things like that. And there are a lot of like gullies carved into the sandy soils and the red soils, but then the black basalt sort of soil is quite waterlogged, I guess, when it rains. So my strategy leading into it was obviously to hunt that red soil and the higher basalt wall elevation, avoiding the black boggy sort of lower grounds, because it had rained for the 3 days leading up to the trip, and then the 3 days that I was out there, it did not stop raining for the whole time, which ended up being a pretty wet, soggy trip, but it paid off in dividends, as you'll come to hear, just because it meant that the deer were extremely concentrated to certain areas. Like there was no sense in me going and hunting these swampy countries where, might be a great place for a boar later in the year when it's dry everywhere else, because everywhere that there was water, it was just inundated, and there were points where I was walking up to water in my ankles to get to the higher elevation, which was a lot drier. So you can imagine these animals want to be comfortable. There's green feed everywhere at this time of year, so feed wasn't an issue. It was just that high ground, somewhere that they can bed without, obviously lying in water. So that leads us into our first stalk of the trip, I guess, is I had got there, and this is at a new property that I'm sort of sussing out to do some potential guiding. And as I got there, it's first thing in the morning, and I'd set out for, ideally, I was trying to take a hind for meat was my prior objective. So as we do on these hunts, I know the countryside pretty well. I tend to know where the deer like to inhabit. So I'd done a short drive from the homestead after saying hello to the property owners, driven out to a bit of a basalt ridge, and with the wind in my face, set off for the morning walk. It was just starting to get that grey lighting, so I was moving pretty slow, trying not to obviously bump anything, because I knew that if I did bump things, they were going to be in high concentration and likely be, bumping whole mobs of deer that would be just switched on for later in the day if I did find them again. But also, I didn't want to be trudging around in the wet grass. I'd rather be on deer instantly and then trying to assess for an opportunity to take a hind for meat. Where that leads me is, in chital deer hunting, the way I hunt is I basically walk with the wind in my face. I'm assessing where the rub lines and all these sorts of things are. And straight away I could see it was very evident that the deer were in the area. Again, because of the wet conditions and the moisture lying on the ground, they were up on the basalt ridges. So every tree that was rubbable for the stags were showing signs that the deer were in the area. Like there's tens of stags in every mob in this place. So, and again, with that higher concentration of deer, it's just that the deer didn't have to move that far to go and rub a tree. And then they see another stag rubbing a tree, so that stag gets a bit angsty and wants to rub a tree as well. So the rutting activity was pretty intense, and it had been, according to both of the property owners that I'd gone and visited over the last couple of months. They said it's one of the best ruts they've ever seen. And again, unfortunately, we'd sort of missed it with spotted safaris, now guided hunts, just because it'd been so wet. But pretty quickly, I noticed that these rubs were like in the area, so I had a bit of optimism, so I really slowed down and was glassing a lot. And that brings me to where, to be honest, I just spotted this orangey shape that didn't seem like a termite mound, and it was probably 800 meters away when I first spotted it, and it just stuck out like a bit of a sore thumb, because the rest of the vegetation was extremely green. So all the grass up there at the moment is about a foot tall, no grass seeds as of yet. It's just that really vibrant green growth that has come up from this wet, like summer rains. And the deer are just smashing it. And to be honest, what I did notice about this odd shape is that it was perched up on a bit of a log, and I just thought it was an unusual spot for there to be a termite mound or something else. And as soon as I popped the glass up, I noticed that it was a dingo. So there was this dingo, mature animal, sitting up on a log about 800 meters away, and I thought, that's pretty cool. I want to go and inspect this. Not to hunt it or anything like that, but to just go and check it out, basically, because dingoes are pretty rare. You don't really see them that often. You see sign of them quite a lot, all their tracks running around, especially when it is wet. They do like to stay on that higher ground themselves, and they walk a lot of the roads rather than in the long, wet grass. But I just thought it was an opportunity, like, again, first hunt of the year, thought, nah, this is pretty cool. I'm going to go and have a look at this dingo. And as I started getting a bit closer, I did notice that in all the folds of the basalt country, there were some deer moving through. And it was pretty cool to watch. But this young velvet stag walked within, 30 or 40 meters. Must have walked downwind of the dingo as well, because it was on my side of the dingo. And you could see it sort of smell it, I think, and then sort of start looking and stamping and stuff. It didn't bark or anything like that. And the dingo was just unfazed. It was just sitting there curled up on the log, probably trying to stay warm because it was quite wet and drizzly. But it was just this cool encounter that reminds you of, how amazing the great outdoors are, and something that you certainly don't see every day. And it was just cool to watch. The dingo was completely unfazed, obviously not hunting, but just sitting there. And I managed to get into about 100 meters of it, and then as I did, I was going to take some photos of it on my phone and stuff like that, but because it was so wet and raining, I'd actually left my camera gear in the car, which was intent from me, because I thought, don't really get the opportunity to hunt much. This is a hunt that I'm doing, like, on this day. I was actually at a place that, as I said earlier, that I'm trying to line up for future guiding, and the property owner had basically said to me, like, if you can take some hinds out, do so, and I wanted the meat as well. So this first little stalk, my objective was to see some hinds and get some meat. If I saw a cracker stag, then I'd obviously go for him as well. But as I neared 100 meters of this dingo, I did notice a bit further out to my right, which the wind suited perfectly as well, but some deer moving up over the basalt from a little bit lower up to higher, where I assumed they were going to start bedding. So I sort of did a bit of a slight deviation of my plan, had sort of satisfied my curiosity with the dingo, got a little bit of video footage and things like that, and then moved over to inspect these hinds. And pretty quickly, it became apparent just how concentrated the deer were. So basically, I started glassing, and as 10 hinds rolled over the ridge, soon a stag joined them, and then another 10 hinds and a stag and another 10 hinds. And pretty quickly, I realised that I was stalking close to 200 chital deer in this massive mega mob that was up on this one big basalt ridge. So pretty quickly, that changes things from, a pretty easy, hopefully, meat hunt where I can just slip in on, 10 sets of eyes and ears, to 200 deer that are spread out over a much wider area. But what I will say is that rain, at this point it's raining pretty heavily. I was in full rain gear, wearing my new Numa 3L rain jacket, which performed really, really well. That was the first test that I'd actually given it. And one thing I did notice about it is that it kept me super dry and warm, but warm isn't too difficult when it's 30 degrees at 9 a.m. in the tropics. But it actually was quite breathable, which is good, because again, with a rain jacket, you can't really put paws in it because then that's going to become permeable and obviously seep water into your underlayers. But for whatever reason, it wasn't super heavy. And even though I was wearing a jacket essentially that was bogged down and wet because of the rain that was just coming in, it never actually seemed to impact me or make me sweat underneath. But anyway, I'm just trying to set the scene as to how wet it was. But with these 200 deer, I was probably a couple hundred meters away at this point, and I just, with slow and direct movements over the next half an hour, didn't have any camera gear, but basically just removed that distance and got into about 40 meters or so of those deer. And when I say I was just surrounded by deer, it's honestly probably an understatement. And again, because of the rain, I think the wind component must have been sort of dampened, and their senses maybe must have been dampened, because I wasn't too worried about them hearing me, just because there was so much moisture and rain and leaf litter, sort of, the ambient noise was obviously quite strong and surrounding it. So if I did step on a stick or anything like that, I wasn't too worried because it was just so quiet and dampened. But also my scent, a few times I checked the wind early in the stalk and it seemed to be blowing, a little bit down to my right or something like that. And there were deer there, but even at 60 meters, none of them were smelling me, which they normally would when it's a lot drier. And I think that might have even had to do with them being quite relaxed in the conditions as well. And because there were so many deer around, they must have been a bit more, confident that if there was in fact danger, that one of the other deer might have detected it. But I still took the stalk pretty seriously. As I said, a lot of it, once I got to 60 meters, was I'd used my binos and had them up near my face initially, closing from a couple hundred meters to about 60 meters. And what I would do is I'd just keep my binos up, and then if I needed to scan anything on my far left or far right away from the direct deer that I was looking at, rather than put my binos down completely to my hip or in my chest harness rig, I'd keep them up just so it's one less movement. Because again, when you're closing in on 200 deer, you might be looking and assessing the 50 deer in front of you, but then there's one deer on your far right or far left periphery. And if you're doing a lot of hand movements and checking the wind a lot and doing all these movements with your hands, it's amazing how quickly deer start picking you out as just something that's not right. And again, I had numerous instances where, for example, I got into 30 meters at the end there, and when I was ranging, I had deer in different parts of the mob sort of look my way and go, oh, what was that? I sort of saw a little bit of movement, even though I was moving extremely slow. I think, again, just because there's a sheer number of animals, it becomes quite hard to get away without, being seen. So that leads me to basically being at 30 meters for the next, 2 hours of this stalk. And it's now getting on in the morning. It's probably around 10 a.m. or 9 a.m. And it was incredible. It was amazing. Because there were so many deer in front of me, I would have a hind stand up from her bed at 30 meters and would want to come to full draw because she'd present a perfect shot. But then because there were so many deer, there was just deer behind them. And it became an ethical issue of not wanting to, again, the gear that I'm using at the moment is a day 6 shaft in the 275 spine, which is a bit of a hybrid between a 250 and a 300. And it's just perfect for running that with the 150 grain Cayuga broadheads, that I'm running at the moment, the Zots by Ian Summers. Which is a nice 2-blade head, and I've had plenty of success with this year on later hunts. But I was just worried basically that if a hind stood up and presented a broadside perfect shot at 30 meters, that my arrow would go through her and either skim off a rock or, hit deflect or bounce or anything and hit one of these other, 50 to 100 deer that were lying behind her. So it was just very tricky, and morally, I just wasn't there. I'd keep waiting and hoping that the right shot would present with a hind that steps in front of a big tree or something like that, that if I at least get a pass through, it's going to etch straight into the tree. But that never really came. And for honestly hours, I would have deer at 30 meters. They would get up after 10, 20 minutes because they were quite restless because the rain was quite heavy, and they would bed down, move another 20 or 30 meters, bed down again for 10 or 20 minutes, and then move another 10 or 20 meters and bed down. And this just kept going on for hours and hours, it seemed, until eventually this dingo from early in the morning decided that he had obviously slept long enough on this log and maybe was feeling a little bit boisterous, and wanted to come in. He'd probably been smelling these chital deer all morning and mucking around with them long into the evening the night before, I imagine. But it came over and added, another component to the stalk. So it was pretty cool to see him come through. And that's when a lot of the deer started noticing him, when he was obviously slinking around in the grass and stuff off his perch. And maybe just because he was moving around and in that more of a hunting mode, they were a lot more nervous. So for the next, hour or so, it was amazing just hearing 200 deer barking. And for those of you who would like to see some of this footage, I did record a little bit of it on my phone. It was super limited just with how heavy the rainfall was. I didn't want to, obviously break a phone, and hence why I didn't have camera gear on this hunt, because I just, didn't want to film and was obviously trying to take a meat hind. But there is a little bit of footage on my Ayden Doumtsis Outdoors Instagram account. It's like under the highlighted section. I think it's called Chital Stag Hunt or something like that. But you can watch some of this hunt and the following hunts that I'll talk about in a second here. On that, it's just like a bit of a live story recap from the day. But essentially, all of that really cool chital deer footage and stuff that I was just, or a behavior that I was just watching of all these young stags rutting and calling, and they were rubbing trees. There were stags doing the Flehmen response with females that must have been in season. There were stags sparring. Nothing that I'd actually like to shoot on the day, but it was simply incredible. And then this dingo obviously comes through and starts spooking the mob, and it was interesting to watch. Like, he would kind of like chase them very briefly, lose interest, and then like start walking away over the basalt. And as soon as he was sort of out of sight from the deer that he'd been chasing, 100 deer would go and chase him over the ridge just to kind of keep eyes on him. And it was kind of funny. And then he'd obviously get interest again and go, oh, okay, cool, they're closing the gap, and would start chasing them back. And this happened for about an hour in front of me. And it was a little bit frustrating because I was trying to just slip out of there at this point. I was like, all right, it's not, feasible that I'm going to be able to take a hind or a deer out of this mob. There was no mature stag that I wanted to hunt. And there were just so many hinds that I was starting to figure I'm going to back out and look for another opportunity to hopefully find a few less deer and either a mature stag or a few less deer and, a likely stalk for a chital deer hind. And that brings us to our next stalk of the day.
Numa Outdoors is our camouflage clothing of choice. The team has formulated a durable, breathable, quiet and comfortable camouflage lineup, suitable for all terrains, season and pursuits, with a great pattern to keep you concealed. You may have recently seen us running the Renegade lineup in our recent adventures up north. We're pleased to announce that Numa products are available in Australia, so head to Venture Hunting Outdoors website to check them out for yourself.
So the next stalk happened pretty quickly thereafter. I'd actually done a big loop once those deer from earlier, the 200 or so, and the dingo had sort of gone about their behaviours and sort of walked over the closest basalt ridge and were out of sight. I took that as an opportunity to back away and then do a big loop to get the wind right and then target some more sort of higher basalt, because it was pretty obvious from that interaction first thing in the morning that a lot of the wildlife was on that higher ground trying to stay high and dry. I'm sort of assuming at this point, to be honest, that the barking from that mob that was going on over the last hour or so with that dingo encounter may have actually attracted this next mob of deer that I encountered. So as I was doing a bit of a loop around, I noticed that probably about a kilometre away, again, being in quite open country, open sort of savanna woodland, I noticed there was a bachelor mob of stags in front of me, and there would have been about 30, 35 individuals within it. Stags of all different age classes, from spikers like first heads all the way through to what ended up being like an over 30-inch Chital Stag. And then there were velvet stags, hard stags, cast antler stags, a bit of everything in there, broken stags, intact stags. It really was like a mix and match sort of mob. But what I did notice, even from about a kilometre away, is that there was one chital deer stag that was super large and massive in comparison to the rest of the deer. And this is being mindful that there were some, probably 28, 29-inch deer within this mob. But there was one particular individual that, again, if you watch some of this footage on my story, you'll be able to see it's just the sheer mass, I think, made him look so much bigger and more mature than everything else. And immediately I sort of, from a kilometre, was like, I'll obviously have a better look at him, but this could be a bit of a shooter. And as I said in the intro, my eyes sort of lit up because hunting chital deer now for 15 years for me, and with spotted safaris, I probably get more pride and joy from watching other people that I guide shoot really nice deer. But to be able to see an animal of this caliber, something that, made me feel a certain way, very quickly made me obviously want to then go and have this stalk. So the deer, over the next half an hour, I just watched them because they were in a spot on a bit of a basalt flat, like up high still, but they just fed through and there was no real landmarks for me to even try and stalk in on them. And with 35 deer, it's still quite a hard task. It's not 200, but it was still a lot of eyes and ears to contend with. So I sort of just sat back patiently, had a bit of a bite to eat, some tuna and a muesli bar and whatnot. And I just watched while they sort of settled and fed towards the 200 deer that I'd seen earlier. And then they pulled up pretty much once they got to the first high, like level elevation bedding area, which for me was like very much a relief because I didn't want them to go and join those other deer from earlier, because that would have just made, the stalk, again, not very high percentage. Whereas the fact that they had fed through, bedded down on the first opportunity, told me that, cool, it's now midday. Hopefully these deer are going to stay bedded for a little while. So I pretty much closed the gap from there quite quickly, cut down, as I said earlier, like 1 kilometre to probably 100 metres or so. And by this stage, I'd glassed the Chital Stag quite well and had very quickly realised that, yep, he's definitely a shooter. He's over that 30-inch mark just from the comparisons I was doing with other deer. With chital deer, I've measured plenty now from stags that I've shot, stags that clients have shot, and up there in North Queensland, their ear length seems to be about that 5 to 6 inches long, which I then use when I look at deer to sort of assess, how many rough ear lengths the deer has, and also things like the skull length, and then timesing that by a certain number normally gets you around 30 inches and things like that. So in sheerly, just even if it wasn't a 30-inch deer, just the sheer mass of this stag's antlers and the symmetry and the fact that he had like little extra points, which are known as basal snags near his brow tines and things, like it was just a deer of a different caliber. Like it was mature and something that I was going to, obviously try and stalk, and with the intention of shooting with the bow. So from there, I, again, was taking this super seriously because I don't get to hunt very much personally for myself. So I try to identify a bit of a direct tree line at this point, and work out if I in fact was coming in from the right angle. I had the wind in my face, but sometimes I will hunt on a bit of a crosswind if it does give me a better tree line to get into, less than 30 meters so that I can make that final shot. But fortunately for me, in the way that I was facing, the wind was perfect, blowing really well in my face. I wasn't really worried about the wind changing too much because it had a good bit of a weather system coming in, so the wind was pretty consistent all day. And these deer were slowly starting to mill around. A few of them had started bedding, and I used the opportunity over the next, 15 or 20 minutes to close the gap from 100 down to around 30 or 40, which is where things started to get a bit more interesting, and like that hyper focus that you've probably heard me talk about on previous podcasts when it comes to hunting, and particularly in stalking chital deer and stuff. It really comes into play where I'm looking at every little detail, and sometimes I can't actually really, talk to it. But if people ask me, like notice something and say like, oh, what are you doing there? I'll be able to explain it. But a lot of the time, I think I just do it as second nature, something that I do, instinctively. But a lot of the things to try and digress what I'm looking for is just to make sure that all the deer that have got their heads up or, are potentially looking my way, is to make sure that they're chewing their cud. So that's one of the biggest things. I'm looking at their ear positioning as well. I'm just trying to think off the top of my head here, but nothing else really phases me too much. As long as I've got a good tree line, I actually prefer to be able to see a lot of the deer because that's what I'm looking for again. Whereas if I have too much tree cover and then I step on a stick and can't see the deer's faces or their heads, and I can't really pick up that, that deer third from the left has stopped chewing its cud and its ears are now facing my way, and take 2 or 3 steps and it notices me, I find that much more like alarming and detrimental to the stalk than if I can see, 20 of the 30 deer's heads, for example, because again, I move so slowly. I'm less worried about getting picked up visually as I am if I can see every one of their heads and account for, their behavior and what they're doing. And again, if they're chewing their cud, their ears are down and relaxed, their eyes are half squinted or shut, better still, then I'm pretty content with making my approach with very, very little cover. So that brings me into, I'm now at around 30 meters from this bigger, more mature stag, and he's surrounded by, as I said, up to about 30 or 35 other individuals. One important note here is that you'll hear me talk a lot when I talk about positioning and closing the gap on these stalks. I normally, as I'm moving in, will range everything. So I'll range the tree that the stag's under, or I'll range the deer, or whatever landmark I can that's as close to the animal as possible to get an accurate read. I'll then range the closest tree that I can get to for cover. So in this instance, it was 30 meters from my last cover to where the stag was. I thought, yep, perfect. Normally from there, I would go on the right-hand side of the tree, being a right-handed side shooter, and I'd have my bow just slightly out from the, cover of the tree for when that stag stands. The rest of my body is pretty much covered, and then my shoulder and the bow pretty much comes to full draw just on the outside, and I can, then shoot the stag, hopefully, when he presents a shot. Of note, with this hunt in particular, I had too many deer closer than 30 meters within that mob. Particularly, there were two little velvet stags that were bedded a little, like 15 meters away from all the other hard antler stags. So they were bedded closer to me. So they're only around 20 meters away, and on my far right. So the wind was fine for them. I wasn't worried about the wind. But the reason I actually positioned on the left-hand side of this tree, which is unusual for me, was purely because I factored in that if my stag stood up at 30 meters and I went to come to full draw, that movement with two deer less than 20 meters away on my very close right would have put me in a tricky situation that may have actually seen me get busted. So again, that's just a little bit of a decision that I'd factored in, and I thought I would rather be maybe more exposed to most of the deer on the left hand side that are a bit further away than the two that are super close on my right hand side. And again, it sort of paid out. Not that I came to, I came to full draw, but we'll get to that in a second, but I didn't get caught out, which was great. So I was basically there at 30 meters for about an hour, just watching these deer. Fortunately, the wind remained really constant and steady and blew in my face, which was great. No birds came to investigate or give up my presence as well, which was great. So aside from just ranging everything and every blade of grass or every rock or basalt that the stag could potentially stand and walk to, from there, it was just a waiting game and being super patient. And when I say waiting game, like for me, the arrow's on the string, the bow's up in front of my face, sitting on my hip. I'm not moving, I'm not mucking around, I'm not, doing different things. I'm basically there with my release aid cued on the string, on the D-loop, ready to draw back once that stag stands and presents me with a shot. So that leads me to the stag standing. And now, unfortunately, he then stood up, was facing left perfectly, broadside, they often do a bit of a scratch and they'll often, defecate. And when he turned his head and was scratching on the offside from where I was, I drew back the bow, settled the pin, and just as I was about to release, he took a couple of steps and that angle changed and I just wanted to reassess. So I'm just watching him through the sight and he turned courting away and then completely bum on or arse on, and there was no shot presented, unfortunately, and he walked further away, probably around 10 meters, and then rebedded just on the back end of a few of the other lesser stags. So unfortunately, obviously, when you're sitting there at 30 meters for around an hour on a Chital Stag, you're pretty desperate to shoot. I was pretty invested at this point. I'd watched him for an hour, trying to, remain calm, keep buck fever and all these things away that we've discussed in previous podcasts, and just remind myself that there's so much has got to go right before you get this stag on the ground. So there's no point thinking about who you're going to message later on and say, hey, I got this stag down, or how good he's going to look on the wall or anything like that. Trying to fight all these thoughts and demons. I pretty much just had to watch as this stag is, fed away another 10 meters and rebedded. And that brings me to the next little dilemma, is that because it was so overcast and drizzly rain and still raining at this point, I had to wait another probably half an hour or so, maybe 45 minutes, for another 8 or so lesser stags that were now bedded between me and him to stand up each of them take their turns to stand up, scratch, do the exact same thing that I've just watched him do, and rebed. And they all fortunately rebedded on the further side away from him. They were chasing like the tiniest little bit of shade, or maybe even high, like dry ground. But fortunately for me, they all bedded just further than him, like whether it be a metre or two and around him. So he was now pretty much the closest stag to me again. Where the issue sort of came in here is that where they had bedded, because again it was so overcast and wet, they didn't bed under a tree. So I didn't have like another tree between me and those stags to get to now, which again made it super difficult. And this is where I tossed up the decision to even continue with the stalk quite a bit in my head. But what sort of sold me, I guess, on making the commitment to continue with the stalk was that when I glassed him up with my binoculars now at 40 metres, I basically made sure that where he was bedded, the way that he was bedded, he was pretty much broadside to me, and he was laying, his bottom was on the right-hand side, or the back end of him was on the right-hand side, his head was on the left, and he was sort of laying there, if you can imagine, with his right shoulder slightly down lower than his left, almost like resting on his right-hand side. Like if you're lying on the couch on your right-hand side, your left's up, ready to, obviously in this case, get shot. And I identified that as I can put an arrow into his left shoulder from an uphill position and shoot down through his right-hand side and basically kill him where he stands bedded, because where he bedded wasn't in the long wet grass as well. So that's an important factor in all of this. And if I hadn't have been able to identify that, yep, I can shoot him while he's still in his bed, then I wouldn't have gone ahead with the stalk. It would have sort of stopped and waited there until, maybe 2 or 3 hours later. At this point, he might have got up again and started feeding for the afternoon, and then I might have had to roll the dice and try and get in really quickly then. But over the next, I don't know how long, to be honest, it happened pretty quick in my head, but it was probably another half an hour or so. I closed the gap from 40 metres to less than 20 metres by doing like a bit of an unconventional stalk for me. So once I left that tree that I was at previously from him at 30 and he'd now fed out another 10 metres, so I'm at 40, I dropped down to the ground. And I don't normally do this with chital deer just because the grass is normally quite dry and any vegetation is super noisy, and I prefer to actually be standing and use vertical cover as a bit of a concealer. But because there was none in this instance and the grass was in this patch quite wet and damp and stuff, I actually lowered down to the ground and was doing a bit of a sliding motion on my hips and my bum. So again, it took me probably another half an hour to close the gap from 40 metres to 20 metres. And then that sort of brought me to basically this point where I identified again, I'm going to have to do something pretty unconventional here and try and basically come to full draw when I get to position on my either hips or knees and not get picked up by 35 deer that are less than 20 metres or 25, 30 metres from me, all chewing their cud, pretty relaxed, but I've got no vertical cover. So if you can imagine me, the way I was crawling in, I was pretty much trying to keep my head below the grass level, and I was just using the tops of his antlers as an indicator as to if he was awake, if he was bedded, if he was down, relaxed, stretching, whatever. So once I got to 20 metres, I could actually see his eyes through the grass and see that he was chewing his cud. And again, using that chewing the cud and everything to assess their alertness and their ear position. And I could see that majority of the stags around him were pretty snoozy at this point. A lot of them had their eyes shut. So I got to 20 metres and pretty much went from my right hip, which was on the ground, and my bow and arrow and everything sitting there, no shoots, no socks, just in my... Again, that's another consideration, is I'd taken my boots and socks off because they were so wet and making little squelchy noises, and just went barefoot, which is, again, a bit of a new thing for me. I normally go in socks with everything just because it adds a bit of padding, but in this instance, everything was so wet, it didn't actually benefit at all. So at 20 metres, I raise up basically from my hip or my bum to my knees slightly and drew back the bow, basically pointing it at the ground. And this, again, you can all see because I sort of was able to self-video it on my phone there and chuck it up on my story. But I draw basically pointing down at the ground and then super slowly raise it up to my eye, just trying not to basically, I knew he was relaxed, but not do any fast movements to attract any attention from the surrounding deer that were all around me, basically in a semi arc in 180-degree view. So bring my bow up and raise the pin, put it on his heart, and there was this tiny little white dot that I'd identified earlier when I was glassing him, as if I can get a shot in there, it's going to take out his heart. And everything went absolutely perfect to plan. When the shot broke, chaos just ensued, and there were white tails going everywhere, brown deer with white spots running in all directions. But I just kept eyes on him, and you can see in the video it happened pretty quickly, definitely less than 10 seconds, but maybe 5 seconds later, he crashed. He did a big wide arc running out to my left, and again, because I'd taken out the top of his heart, he'd obviously gone on this fatal death march and run and pretty dramatically, crashed to the ground, and that was it. But it was just amazing. I was obviously pretty stoked. It had been a long time for me hunting chital deer, and to shoot a deer of that caliber, have everything go perfectly, was absolutely amazing. The rest of the mob didn't know what was going on. In fact, they sort of sat there at around 70 meters and were just barking and carrying on, looking at the deer, looking back and forth to where they'd just been bedded, and then back to the deer that was down on the basalt. And again, I just sat there and took it all in for 10 to 15 minutes until they slowly moved off. And then I went over to obviously inspect and try and find my arrow, which I'd seen was sort of in him as he ran off, but I'd found it and had broken off and had awesome peno. And again, the day 6 shaft and the Cayuga broadhead had done a really good job. The reason it didn't get a full penetration pass through was because I dare say it coming in from a high down to a lower elevation from my shooting position at 20. I think it must have banged into the rock and the grass and the dirt behind him and obviously stopped penetrating. And then as he's run, he's snapped off the arrow as he was running through, and his shoulders were sort of locked up. But I was able to go over to him and take some incredible photos, take a moment with him just to appreciate this beautiful chital deer stag, and basically go from there. I then butchered him all up and was able to take, the neck meat, the back legs, back straps, tenderloins, the heart, all of these amazing cuts. His front legs, unfortunately, were pretty buggered just because of the dramatic bruising and breaking in bones and things like that from the arrow shaft. But I'm happy with that. If it does the job and results in a quick, clean, humane death, then, I'm happy to obviously shoot animals through the heart. And as we've discussed on previous podcast topics, that's, to be honest, where the heart is behind the scapula there. And that arrow's done the job. And whilst it was a bit of a shame to leave the front quarters, nothing really gets wasted up there in North Queensland. And to pack out a deer of that quality and sort of get everything butchered up was absolutely amazing. It's been a long time coming for me, and for those interested, when I did end up taking the stag home and boiling him out and everything like that, he ended up going a bit over 31 inches, which was amazing. He's got super mass, very symmetrical, great inners. I think his inners are around 8.5 inches long, and then his brow tines are around 11, but very, very even, all very similar. His right and left antler are pretty much the same. And then he's got these 2 little basal snags. So just everything you could ask for in a chital deer. His mass is probably my favourite aspect, to be honest, because it just shows he's an old deer, and then he had very few teeth left. So just an animal that's lived his whole life out on the basalt wall there in North Queensland, and the fact that he got to go home with me and be utilised as, obviously the skull and antlers and things, but also all the meat, which will be amazing for future meals, was just something that I was extremely appreciative for, and pretty much why I do it. Chital deer are my favourite deer species that I'm very shameless about. I'll plug them till the end of the world. I've set up a guided hunting business around them. So to be able to take a stag of that calibre was just amazing. Born out of necessity, Day 6 designs and builds specialised equipment for hunters. Their arrows are bomb-proof and consistent. I'm currently running their 275 spine shafts. The split between the usual 250 and 300 spine shaft is perfect for the heavier broadhead that we run. Coming in at 11.8 grains per inch, this setup is perfect for all game here in Australia and beyond. The afternoon got even more crazy and better from there. Not that I thought it could, but as I finished butchering up this stag and went to sling on my backpack, I basically slung on my backpack, which would have been pretty heavy at this point. As I said, I had the back legs, all the meat in there, the neck meat and the stag skull and everything like that. And where I slung it on my back and was starting to do up my belt buckles, I looked up and I'd noticed these deer running, which was probably the same 200 deer from earlier that morning. They were about 800 meters away or so at this point. And there were just deer running absolutely everywhere. But then amongst the deer, I noticed these two odd sort of, I guess, silhouettes or creatures that were running in there. And it turned out that that dingo from earlier had returned and was with a mate. So this was pretty cool. Again, I just sort of sat there to myself and thought, geez, I've just done all this, butchering and stuff. I've just put the meat on my pack, but I'm going to race over there and go and check it out. And basically it was pretty cool to watch these dingo run the deer around essentially and try and mob them up, and then they'd run through the middle of them and the deer would all scatter, and it was crazy. The Chital deer stags were showing such athleticism in evading these dingoes. Like they were jumping clean over cattle fences, which, for us is obviously a hard task. For them, they're athletes, they did it with a bit of ease. But what I found interesting was a lot of the hinds and the fawns would run through the fences at very high speed, and I think that's the strategy of what these dingoes were doing. They would one would round them up and then the other one would run through the middle of them, and they were kind of doing it right in the corner of this paddock. And I think they were relying on the stress that they were causing and the, chaos that they were causing to try and get these young chital deer and the fawns to get stuck in the fence for a second so that they could run over there and obviously deliver the final blow and try and suffocate and maul and kill one of these chital deer fawns. But this went on for about, I don't know, maybe 5 minutes as I closed the gap pretty quickly from 800 meters or so just to go and have a closer look. And it, was pretty cool to watch. They obviously don't care about ethics and morals and all these sorts of things, because if we thought, I'm going to try and chase a deer until it gets stuck in a fence and I'm going to go and shoot it, people would say, that's pretty cruel and whatever. But Mother Nature really doesn't care, and these dingoes are just looking for their next feed. But I ended up watching them walk away basically, and they weren't able to catch anything. But what they did was they walked down off the basalt down towards a bit of a creek that flows by, and there was this big tea tree clump there, and I thought, they might be going down to rebed or something like that. But little did I know, as I got a bit closer, I noticed that there was this crunching noise going on, and it turns out that those same two dingoes had obviously killed a chital deer the previous day, so their hunting strategy was definitely working. And this was just a little bit of a fawn carcass once I came to find it a bit later on. But where this hunt changed for me from being like a passive observer, I guess, to actually wanting to shoot these dingoes was I sort of noticed how close they were to the house. The house from the property owners that I was hunting on was literally 300 meters away at this point. So I just figured, and they're pretty tolerant of dingoes and stuff, but most property owners up in North Queensland want dingoes shot just because of the effects they have on cattle and the production system and all these type of things with calves and preying on those. But I've come to really like the dingoes, so this was a bit of a moral conundrum for me. I wasn't quite sure what to do, but the fact that they were so close to the house and these guys have potty calves and dogs of their own and all this type of stuff and kids and whatnot, I just thought, bugger it, I will, if I can get close enough, shoot one. So I'd managed to sneak into around 10 meters of one dingo as it was chewing on some bones and end up shooting it, and it went less than 10 meters and expired. And again, it's not something that I was, really happy with or chuffed with, to be honest, nothing comparable to the chital deer. As I said earlier, it was more of a means to an ends and trying to balance the system for these property owners. But nevertheless, it was still really, really interesting to watch these dingoes go about their hunting, and then obviously find success and have a dead chital deer fawn that they'd killed the previous day. And just goes to show how successful they are and why they're obviously at the top of the food chain as well. So as you'll see, the next day I actually went out and did a bit of filming once the conditions sort of went from bucketing down with rain to a little bit less rain. And I actually didn't have my bow with me, and another dingo actually had walked past me at around 2 meters or so. So that footage is in there. Again, this was a really white-faced dingo with lots of scars and battle scars on him and stuff. He looked a little bit worse for wear, but he walked right into me from around 40 or 50 meters. Beelined it up to me, almost looked at me for a second as if to be like, what's going on here? What are you? But then I dare say the outline and the breakup of the new camouflage that I've been wearing was enough to just keep him moving. And sure enough, yeah, he sort of just walked past me, and it was a pretty cool moment to not obviously shoot every single dingo that I see. And this guy was a bit further from the house and stuff, so I was happy to just go about that encounter. But for anyone that wants to watch it again, it's on that highlights there, and it really is some cool footage to see, an apex predator walk by and be so close for a matter of time, because they're normally pretty elusive and pretty secretive, these dingoes. So again, that dingo encounter was definitely something to take away, and one of the highlights for the trip for me.
Option Archery makes specialist hunting gear. I'll never not be able to use a equivalizer again. They're truly one of my favourite bits of kit. It combines a stabiliser and equivalizer to increase the functionality of my hunting strategy. It enables me to put my bow on my shoulders, which enables me to glass more when I'm out in the field. Shop both equivalizers and their option sight range today by heading to the website.
So the last, topic that I really want to talk about here is some of the lessons that I learned and some takeaways from the trip. More so regarding to the wet weather hunting. It was a long time since I've hunted in rain that severe. But for wet weather hunting in general, I think gators would have been something that I really would have looked forward to and probably utilised quite well. Not for snake reasons or anything like that. So snake gators, this is what I'm talking about. But just purely from an aspect of keeping the boots dry in this wet weather. And I've found this quite a lot in temperate areas or areas where there's heavy dew in the morning. I'm experiencing it a little bit here on some of these hunts that James and I are doing for red deer in New South Wales and sort of southeast Queensland, when there's a thick, blanket of fog and dew in the mornings, and then it gets all over the long grass and the vegetation if it's been a good season. It just gets your boots wetter so much quicker. Like, you don't have to do a creek crossing to get your boots wet. They're wet basically all the time, unfortunately, and it's going to happen to even the best boots because they're just saturated essentially. So another benefit of gators that I really like is obviously the snake component. Not that I was worried in this case, but even for grass seeds, like when the vegetation gets a little bit longer. So I would say as something to look into if you're a hunter and you do experience this same, wet boots from dewy mornings and stuff, just having that, like gators, can obviously keep everything a bit closer and more intact and locked up and stuff, but also prevent your boots from getting super, super wet. The next thing I want to dive into is I have been using the Option Archery sight, the Option 4S in particular. It's a single pin sight, but it's also like multiple pin. It's super versatile, which is absolutely amazing. I'm really, really loving. So, for example, if I was to call a dingo in or call a red stag in, as I'm doing here in, New South Wales and southeast Queensland over the last couple of weeks, I'd be using the multiple pin sight just because you don't know if that animal's going to pull up at 30, 20, 10, 40, whatever it may be. Whereas for this stag hunt, I knew that he was bedded at 20. I had time to flip my sight housing out, get rid of all the pins, and then get rid of all the clutter and just put a single pin at 20 meters, draw back and shoot him through the heart. So again, don't want to talk about it too much, but the Option Archery sights is something that I'm really, really enjoying, just for that versatility of, I'm going to set up here for a red stag coming in. Don't know if it's going to pull up at 30, 40 or come in right into 20 or less. Having the multiple pin sight there means you're not sort of having to like split pin gaps or anything like that. It's been really, really handy. So just something to consider if you're sort of a hunter that does like the benefits of, a couple of pins in their sight housing, but then also wants the ability to flip that all the way out the front and dial a pin to, 33 meters if there's a stag bedded, or if there's a buck on his scrape or something like that and he's staying still, you can just do that and have that versatility. It's really great. Another thing that I took away from this trip, particularly when it comes to that stalk on those 200 deer early in the morning, was simply the, I guess, challenge of videoing deer. And I think that's where James and I doing these twin element films and things, we probably don't take it for granted how much better as hunters and stalkers and stuff that we've got, because we have to get consistently, 2 people with camera gear, with bows, to within 30 meters to have a shot on film. And I think the simplicity of like not having camera gear just because it was raining so much, and the burden of trying to get 2 people in, and the fact that this was a solo hunt, the fact that I was, went out with the objective on this particular day to try and shoot a hind for meat or a mature stag for, a trophy and meat quality and stuff. It was such a blessing. But it also reiterated that these tiny slight movements, whether it's glassing within 50 meters or ranging or pulling your phone out to take a photo or dialing the focus on a camera, all of these tiny little things really do get picked up by deer. And I think by minimizing all of that on this hunt, it allowed me to get in super, super close to 200 deer, which is normally quite the task. So again, my learning point and something that I'd take from this hunt in particular was, that the slight movements can make a huge difference. And it works both ways, because I like to think of, when we're looking at the landscape in front of us, and then a stag that's bedded shakes his antlers a tiny bit, or a deer lifts its tail or shakes an ear or flicks, its ear or whatever, it stands out. Like, we can see some of these things from, hundreds of meters away, and it works both ways. So just trying to be super, streamlined with a lot of your movements, move slowly, be patient, stick to some cover, stick to the shade. All these little takeaways are super important when it comes to stalking deer, and particularly chital deer when they're in big mobs. So speaking of stalking, again, I sort of touched on it a little bit there, but I normally do a lot of upright stalks. Very few do I actually lower to my knees or crawl or anything like that, unless there's a real clear, distinct advantage. And in this case, I just thought it was interesting, and it's going to feed into my next point. I normally trust my bow cam, and I normally have that sitting on my hip, my lower cam, and then my upper cam, covering my face as I do these stalks. And I always try and actually move forward, especially when I'm at like 30 meters or less, or 60 meters trying to get to 30 meters. I always move forward with my bow in front of my face, arrow on the string, and then my left foot forward in front of my right, just as a right-hander, so that I can always draw if something gets up and slowly starts feeding towards me and I can't really take another step. At least if I'm caught in that position, my left foot's forward and I've got like a good anchor to draw and then shoot subsequently. So that's just something to consider. But what I also wanted to talk about is just practicing the weird shot sequences. So from this hunt, you obviously heard that I shot from my knees. If I had never shot at a target from my knees, that would be something super nerve-wracking, I guess. Whereas the fact that I shoot my bow pretty regularly, shoot from a range of different positions. I shoot from a deck, sometimes downhill. I shoot uphill. I shoot from my knees. I shoot after doing push-ups. I shoot after going for a run. I shoot after going to gym. I shoot before all those things. There's knowing where, your 30 meter pin hits if you've got a multiple pin sight. Knowing where your 30 meter pin hits at 20 meters is going to be super versatile for some of these hunts, because it doesn't always happen textbook where, you've got your pin set and the animal stops at 30 meters and you've ranged it and it's 30 on the dot. Sometimes an animal stops at 25 and you go, oh, am I using my 30 meter pin or am I using my 20 meter pin? It's good to know, especially if you have multiple pins, how to split shoot and shoot, 25 meters between the 20 and 30 pin. Or if you've got the option side, as I said earlier, being able to flip that housing if you've got time, move your pin to 20, your sliding single pin to 25 and shoot him at 25 meters. Being able to draw your bow and hold and then shoot for after a minute of waiting is super important. So if you take anything away from this last little segment, it's just practice drawing, from your knees, raising from your hip, like your rump and your hip to your knees, and then shooting. Like, there's so many different variations that we can do as hunters that are just going to help you, because nothing is sort of as it seems when you're out in the field. And this stalk in particular was one of those instances. The last thing I wanted to touch on is if you're in the market for rain gear in particular, the Numa 3L rain jacket is super lightweight, dries really, really fast. And to be honest, as you've heard from this podcast, I was really, really impressed with it over this 3-day Chital hunt. It did not stop raining the whole time. We had a couple 100 mils of rain and it stood up to the test. It was moist and hot and humid, and overnight I just hung it over, a chair in camp, and it was able to dry out pretty well, where the following morning I obviously wasn't cold or too wet to put it back on and just hunt all day with it. So again, it's something that I always have in my backpack in a dry bag, just to make sure that, if it does rain, even when you're on, a normal temperate hunt and it's blue skies, if it rains for half an hour, I just whip the lightweight rain jacket out, stay dry, and then put it back in the dry bag, make sure I'm drying it out when I get home and back to camp later on. But at least that way you're not sort of uncomfortable for the rest of the day with wet weather gear sort of bogging you down. But they're just a few takeaways from me from this hunt, and hopefully some lessons that you guys can learn from. Huntin' Full is the foremost hunting resource with varied levels of memberships to get you on your next adventure. Whether it be an annual trip or once-in-a-lifetime adventure, Huntin' Full and the consultancy team will cater to your needs. James and I have been utilising their services for a couple of years now, and virtually immediately, James reaped the rewards when he drew a coveted limited entry elk tag. James would not have known about the opportunity, let alone ever applied for this unit, and therefore, without the assistance of our friends at Huntin' Full, a hunt like this would not have been achievable. If you're interested in using Huntin' Full's license application services to draw more tags across the Western United States, then please email applications@huntinfull.com and mention Twin Elements to get 25% off your first year of service. The Huntin' Full team will take care of it from there. Alrighty guys, we have come to the point of the show where I answer your frequently asked questions. If you have any questions relating to the podcast that you want answered, please send us an email with the subject line FAQ to info@twinelements.com.au, or simply DM us at Twin Elements, Ayden Doumtsis Outdoors, or James Doumtsis Outdoors on any of our social media, particularly the Instagram. I would say that we're most active on there, and we will strive to answer them on future podcast episodes. This week's questions were actually sent in via email by Stuart Anderson, and Stuart has said, what do you guys pack for lunches, drinks and snacks for a day out in the bush? Now, we actually answered this, I think, pretty well on episode 10 of the podcast. That was called Gear Dump from Memory. It was like our rut ready edition sort of thing. And to be honest, the older we've got, the more we're doing it, the simpler we sort of get, especially when it comes to day hunts. Generally, we aren't really restricted by, weight or volume of the food that we take on these hunts. So we also do have a little bit of variety when it comes to what we do pack. But our go-to would definitely be something that's like high in protein. Protein sources such as jerky, tuna, sardines, salami, something like that. We're really big on tuna and sardines at the moment. They're just so easy to pack and then obviously eat, and they're always, different flavors and things that you can go for. We then also generally have like an assortment of nuts and trail mix, which we normally just buy in big bags and then chuck into little Ziploc bags for like that day ration. Again, they're high in fats and proteins and really good for you when you're out hunting. We then always run a combination of like hydration and supplements, which we are finding super important, particularly on all these big trips that we're doing where we're often backing it up. Like for the rut, for example, we've been out hunting since, end of March. It's now April, like mid-April sort of thing. We've been running basically every day, miles and miles in the mountains, doing this super marathon like work, in the sense that we're carrying heavy backpacks, carrying heavy camera gear, carrying, deer out of the hills, all this type of stuff. We essentially treat ourselves like athletes, where we need to stay hydrated, have all these supplements and stuff to keep ensuring that we can keep going on over the coming weeks, so that we can achieve our goals and shoot these deer and have these experiences that we want. So a lot of what we've mentioned will simply stay in the pack and doesn't need to be like removed or refrigerated. That's one of the benefits with a lot of what we take as well, like all the tuna and stuff. We've got like boxes that we just chuck in the car, and then we can live out of them for a couple of weeks if needed. I guess, Stuart, if you need, more substantial meals, we'll sometimes make, like over the last few weeks, we've been making venison or goat mince wraps, where it's simply just we make that in the morning, eat that for lunch if we're out on the mountain, or we'll have it for brekkie. We also, if we're going to pack like a jet boil or something like that as a bit of a luxury sort of hunt, or if it's super cold, we might make a coffee during the day. We can also then obviously have like dehydrated meals and things like that. But as far as most of our lunches and drinks and stuff, we're loving the stuff from Atlas Wild. They're doing an awesome job with some great hydration and supplements. We love their Rise in the mornings, and then Fusion and stuff like that, more so for the pack outs or later in the day, just as, something to replenish your system. But they've also got the Regenerate, which is really good hydration. And like electrolytes for the middle of the day, just to keep you going.
Know where you stand with onX, the most accurate GPS mapping tech for outdoor enthusiasts, trusted by millions of hunters worldwide. We utilize onX whilst hunting in the US. Its mapping systems, specialist drop pins, tracking features, topographical maps, and accuracy is unmatched. Being able to plan and prepare for our hunts overseas in the comfort of our own home is a game changer. If you're looking at hunting in the US, Canada, or Alaska, then onX is a must.
The next question has also been sent in by Stuart, and it was a bit of a follow-on, and he just says, I found this great little spot amongst the thick stuff. Big if, but hopefully we'll take a deer here. What are your thoughts on what the effect will be on the other deer in this system when they come across the carcass of the deer taken in this area? Will it send them elsewhere, or from your experience, will they just continue to inhabit this zone? My target species is Sambar, but guessing this might apply to all species. Yeah, you're definitely right there. From like my personal experience, gut piles and carcasses don't have like a significant effect on the deer movement. I think more so the human scent that's left in the area from butchering and from hunting, especially if you've been hunting an area for a few days trying to get a particular deer, and then you do shoot the deer, your boots to the ground and all that sort of scent might be having more of an effect, and say pressuring those animals rather than the sort of natural smell of guts. For example, I've definitely experienced, with animals such as feral pigs, bantang in particular, buffalo, and even some deer, that very shortly after killing and butchering an animal, I've seen the other animals that we haven't shot or anything like that acting normally within close proximity of the site. And obviously with bantang, pigs, buffalo, anything that's relying heavily on like water systems or a food source, particularly up north where things often get super concentrated. If you've got, 100 bantang living on a swamp and you shoot a bantang bull in one corner of the swamp, they're not going to care. They're going to, same as pigs, they're probably going to end up eating it if it's pigs or foxes or whatever like that. But in the event of sambar deer, you may get some animals that are a little bit curious and may a little bit like change their movement for a short period of time. But again, it's all pretty quick, pretty natural. By the time you get blowflies, maggots, bugs, birds, all these things returning it back to the system, I don't think it's going to have too much of an effect personally on your hunting. But good luck on that pursuit of a sambar, and hopefully you can secure some meat and a nice trophy. Alrighty, so that wraps us up for today's podcast. I really hope you guys enjoyed that one. I have enjoyed sort of revisiting that successful Chital Stag stalk, and really do look forward to hopefully getting out again with a couple of clients in the coming months. I've got a few hunts booked for the end of April and May, which is going to be absolutely awesome because, as I said, I've sort of been deprived of these spotted safaris hunts. As I said earlier, if you do want to get in touch, make sure you send me a message on either Ayden Doumtsis Outdoors or the Spotted Safaris socials, as well as the email, and I'll get back to you there. I'm going to try and ramp up the Spotted Safaris hunts now that I'm back in North Queensland, and have transitioned from the Northern Territory where I was living last year to North Queensland. It's just a lot closer to home, and hopefully going to enable me to do this more because I really do love it and have a massive passion for it. But As you're listening to this, we are currently away hunting roaring red stags. This is a bit of a transition day as we're moving between different places, but we've already got a few critters on the deck and we've captured some beautiful content down here in the Red Deer Hills. So we should have plenty of new content dropping over the coming weeks to months once we return from the bush. When we do get back, we will be kicking off our newest YouTube releases focusing on our NT adventures from last year. There's obviously a number of buffalo, bantang and boar hunting films going to be dropping every Wednesday evening from the normal time of 6 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. So please make sure that you're subscribed to the YouTube channel to keep up to date with all of those epic films. We really can't wait to share them all with you. And we did have some amazing hunts with our friend Paddo from Dingo Creek Safaris. So if you're interested in a hunt with him, make sure you look him up. He's on socials and everything like that. James, Dad and I are definitely looking forward to getting back there one day soon. Speaking of our YouTube channel, hopefully you've all seen and entered our 20k YouTube subscriber giveaway. If you're late to the party, please do head over to our YouTube, like and comment on the giveaway video and make sure that you subscribe to our channel to be in the running. You can win $1,000 worth of prizes from some of the most generous brands in the industry who support us and whose products we use and love. We've got prizes including a pair of lower ranges from Lower Boots, an Option 4S sight, which is that sight that I mentioned earlier that I'm running. That's donated generously from Option Archery. We've got the Dragonfly knife from Day 6, broadheads and apparel from Cayuga Broadheads, caffeine pouches from OzCaf Energy, supplements and electrolytes from Atlas Wild, incredible coffee from none others than the legends at Dog and Gun, a rolling knife sharpener from Kimbo Australia, Day 6 shafts from Venture Hunting and Outdoors, and more. We have really gone all out with this giveaway, and as I said, we're excited to give that to one lucky winner. We have some more stories coming to you from Red Deer Camp. So as you've heard, this podcast has very much been like a reliving the last little successful hunt. James and I are going to relive in the excitement from some of our last couple of weeks where we've been hunting red deer. So we know that you're going to love those next installments of the podcast, and we're really keen to come to you from Red Deer Camp and release those. So stay tuned for part 1, dropping next week on the podcast. Please continue to subscribe, review, and rate the podcast. We appreciate the support we're getting on this, and obviously you guys are really enjoying it too because we're getting some amazing feedback. Like, it's been truly humbling, basically getting messages from all of these people, particularly over the Rut and Raw, saying like, hey guys, your fallow podcast was next level. It helped me, learn how to doe call, learn when to doe call. And I managed to get a fallow buck after 5 years of bow hunting this property. Things like that have been truly, really great for James and I to obviously see. Particularly while our hunting wasn't quite going to plan, and now that things are turning a corner, which you'll hear about on the next podcast, it's great to obviously share on all the success with you guys. But just in general, the podcast is doing really, really well, and again, we're really appreciating you guys for sharing it. So I hope you enjoyed this one. It's been a solo podcast from me, but I am looking forward to sharing the platform next week with my co-host James Doumtsis, and share with you guys all that we've been up to over the last couple of weeks. So thank you, legends, as always, and I hope you enjoyed.